1, 2, sound test.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I believe you had enjoyable lunch session. Apologies for slight delays. I'll call it slight delays because when you are dealing with the leaders, I was told in Africa, leaders are never late. But it's also important to observe punctuality. Our initial intent was to pick up with this process at 2. We had a spillover of 51 minutes, but definitely we will find means and the ways of recovering on that lost time. And of course, with a lot of support from your end. I want to slightly alter the protocol because I know there are new members of parliament who were not with us yesterday, and give them just 1 minute for introduction each. Members of parliament only. Members of parliament, speakers, and the parliament fraternity. That is what I'm calling members of parliament. Yes, those who were not there yesterday. Proceed.
Thank you very much. My name is John Medhu, Senator for Nyandarua. Chairman Committee on the Senate Standing Committee on Lands, Environment and Natural Resources.
Feel much welcome, Senator Medhu, and it's indeed great pleasure to see you here with us for this particular process. For those who are walking in, we had allowed a minute, at least each for members of parliament who joined us today and who were not with us yesterday. So take your 1 minute to introduce yourself. The mic is just right in front of you.
Thank you very much. I don't know, I'm lifting my hands. You can see I'm here. My name is Karongo Wadhangwa, the Miracle Senator of Kiambu County. I'm the chairperson at the Senate of Roads, Housing, and Transportation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'll add Miracle to your name. And of course, the processes that we will be running we'll indeed expect to see a lot of positively transformative miracles. So who else on that extreme end? Yes, proceed.
No, thank you very much, Program Director. My name is Debo Mudise. I'm from South African Parliament. I'm the chairperson of Select Committee on Land Reform, Environment, Mineral and Energy. Thank you.
Feel much welcome to this process.
Thank
and
you, sir.
to Kenya. Another person that I might have missed? Proceed.
I am Moses Krima, Member of Parliament, Kenyan Parliament, and I have a motion as related to climate change in the Parliament, whereby we are saying that there are some sorts of crops which are really affecting the climate, especially the eucalyptus trees and drying of rivers. Thank you.
Quite interesting, quite interesting. I think you arrived and you came to the right session and with the right spirit. Any other member of parliament that I might have missed? Great, sorry. Another member of parliament that I might have missed who did not introduce himself yesterday or who was not present yesterday? Good, I think we need to settle for the business of the day. And the business of the day is actually cut around 2 important areas. The first is around building or developing the tenets of the model law that we are looking into, particularly on climate change. That is the first area that we will be focusing our energies on. And the second area that we'll be focusing our energy on is basically in developing and adopting some certain key messages from parliamentarians that can actually go to African Climate Summit to inform the substantive elements of the declaration to be adopted during the Africa Climate Summit. So those are the two elements that we'll concern ourselves with this afternoon. I promise with your cooperation, we'll try to do best with time, but equally we'll ensure that we've given space for all to participate. For those who joined today, not all are members of parliament. We are also mixed, because when it comes to development of model law, it is indeed important to derive and benefit from views from the cross-section of society and perspectives from all over. I think coming back to the first substantive area, which is development of the mondial law, this derives from the third Pan-African Parliamentarian Summit on climate policy and equity that was held in Midrand, but it is also reinforced by a resolution of PAP sitting over the month of May in Midrand again, which again mandated a Pan-African Parliament to lead the process of developing a model law to guide the continent. But it has its own basis. Part of the bigger resolution that came from Midrand was actually on parliamentarians across Africa to strengthen laws that lead to environment, climate change within the continent. The model law that we are beginning to discuss, again, is drawn from certain perspectives and consideration. Number one, not all African countries are at the same level in terms of developing climate change laws. Some have progressed, some are still behind. And there is need to support one another to ensure that within the continent, we have a regime of laws that can actually help us move to the next level. The second area from where this derives is a number of declarations or even the UNFCCC instrument itself, the Paris Agreement and its domestication, and also a number of global protocols that we've entered into and we've not provided. Protocols related to climate change and environment, which we've entered into as a continent, but we've not been able to anchor them within our context. But then thirdly, looking at how climate change plays within our continent, it is not confined by our political boundaries. Indeed, it transcends social, political, economic boundaries, and therefore the need to give a perspective that recognizes those particular elements, and particularly cross-border elements, which are very critical. But then we also have weak states in Africa who might not necessarily do it on their own, and therefore there is need for us to begin to look at that. And then very finally is also beginning to look at, from a legislative perspective, how are we able to pool our energies in a collective manner to advance a collective agenda. So that is where the whole process derives, and it is important to keep that in perspective. I will be inviting two presenters who will speak. I know their presentations are up. The first presenter is actually Phoebe Mafungu Clement, is the PAP legal counsel, and he will largely be dealing with the background and the roadmap to the framework of the model law on climate change, a session that he hopes to execute with precision, and he is also ready to take questions on that particular session. Welcome, Phoebe Mavungu, to take the floor. and execute your mandate. Thanks. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. I'm going to discuss the formulation process and particularly the background and the process of formulating the model law on climate change in Africa. So my presentation will start with giving a brief background to the PAP mandate in relation to formulating model laws, because as much as we have members of parliament, I believe that it may be important to share that particular element to other participants. Then I will go deep into the model lawmaking process, and I'll discuss the legal and policy framework guiding formulation of the model law, and I will end with sharing the subsequent steps we are going to take following this meeting. As we know, the Pan-African Parliament is one of the many organs of the African Union, which is specifically mandated to ensure the full participation of African peoples in the development and economic integration of the continent. And this stems from various instruments, starting from the treaty, the African Economic Community Treaty, also called the Abuja Treaty, the Constitutive Act of the African Union, and the PAP Protocol, which lay out the mandate of the Pan-African Parliament, which is essentially advisory, next slide, advisory and consultative. And within that mandate, a number of functions are defined, and most of them are in consonance with the normal functions of any parliament. But model law formulation relates to the quasi-legislative function of the Pan-African Parliament, which, in accordance with its protocol, comes from the fact that Pan-African Parliament shall harmonize laws of the member states of the African Union. And in trying to harmonize those laws, the Pan-African Parliament can use several means, including developing model laws. Of course, there's a new protocol of the Pan-African Parliament, which next slide, protocol is not yet into force. Currently, we have 24 signatures and 15 ratifications, and we hope that very soon we will be getting the 28 requisite ratifications for it to enter into force. So currently, we are still operating under the CIRT protocol, which indeed mandates the Pan-African Parliament to harmonize and coordinate, next slide, coordinate the laws of the member states, but also to promote and coordinate and harmonize policies, measures, programs, and activities of the regional economic communities and their parliamentary fora. And I think this makes it even interesting. And yesterday, and probably today, we have MPs from the East African Legislative Assembly, and
it is part of the main mandate of the Pan-African Parliament to work with them and other regional parliaments to ensure that we move together in an harmonized way with in the spirit of policy coherence, including on issues to do with climate change. When it comes particularly to model lawmaking, the Pan-African Parliament has a process which, next slide, which makes provision particularly for the African peoples, African civil society, and all concerned stakeholders to get involved in the process because their views matter. That is why in our procedural guidelines for model lawmaking, we have 3 stages which make room for peoples, for citizens to be part and parcel of the process. The initiation process allows any citizen or civil society to trigger the process of model law formulation. And the formulation process also allows for citizens, African citizens and civil society to be part and parcel of the elaboration of the model law. And of course, adoption is reserved to our continental representatives. So far, the Pan-African Parliament has adopted 6 model laws, which you can see on your left-hand side. And currently, we are working on 6 other model laws, including the model law on climate change. This model law, as the moderator said, is rooted in the resolution of the Pan-African Parliament on development of a model law on climate change, which was adopted in June this year, but also other AU legal and policy frameworks, whether treaty or non-treaty instruments. The draft model law also refers to AU and international legal policy commitment made by African Union member states, because as you may know, developing national legislation is also a way of domesticating international commitment from the UN and the regional level. The resolution also underscores the fact that a model legislation on climate change in Africa can inform and trigger climate action and guide policy formulation at all levels, whether national or even provincial and local level. And of course, the resolution takes cognizance of the fact that there are other countries that have already been able to adopt climate change laws or related laws. And indeed, those countries will be, we will be leveraging on the advance they have taken on other countries, which will create impetus and where best practices will be used. Secondly, the resolution, in a nutshell, approves that a model law should be developed and vested a mandate on the committee, Permanent Committee on Rural Economy, Agriculture, Environment, and the Natural Resources to lead its formulation, working together with other stakeholders, particularly PACJA, FAO, Barclay, and any other interested organizations. The legal and policy framework to guide the model law process comes basically from 3 various legal regimes, particularly as an African Union organ, the Pan-African Parliament will be inspired by the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which is not per se a climate or an environmental treaty, but in it you can find some windows or some provisions talking or provisions which can have a bearing on the management of climate change. Equally, the treaty establishing the African Economic Community, under which the Pan-African Parliament is set up, but also various African Union human rights treaties have provision guaranteeing the right to safe environment, for instance. All these instruments and other instruments that are specifically climate or environment related will be used to guide the content of the model law, because by drafting the model law, we will be giving effect at the national level to the commitments of the member states. The list is long, but equally we have policy instruments, and I won't pass without mentioning Agenda 26.3, which in one of the aspirations call for the member states and the continent as a whole to achieve an environmentally sustainable climate and resilient economies and communities. And we have a rosary of policy instruments, which because of time, I will just skip. At the UN level, we also have human rights treaties, which protect the right to healthy environment, the right to sustainable development, the right to health, and so forth. We also have multilateral environmental agreements, which can also be used, taking into account the level and the extent to which the African Union member states have ratified them. Bearing in mind that states would be obligated to domesticate an instrument only if it has ratified it. Then policy instrument at the UN level, but indeed we will also be guided by the initiatives at the regional economic communities level, and particularly the RECs that we have and the 3 regional climate commissions. All the pronouncements in place will be used to the extent possible to inform the content of the model law. Lastly, best practices from how various legislation, and Professor is going particularly to dwell on that, will indeed allow to map out the best practices and try and replicate, taking into account the commonalities, but also the specificities of the different countries and regions. Maybe you can go back to the previous slide. While doing so, we will also have to be sensible to a number of issues. First of all, the typologies and contents of laws. Typologies will enable us to inquire whether it is necessary to come up with a single and comprehensive law covering all aspects that may be directly or indirectly concerned with climate change, or whether we should keep the approach of what exists probably in some countries where the various aspects concerned by climate change are regulated by different laws. For instance, you have a law on forest management, a different law on water management, and another law on management of soils, and so forth, or whether we should have one body regulating the various policy areas. Also, we will have to be mindful, particularly because Africa has three main legal regimes, legal traditions, and we know that in civil law, in countries with civil law tradition, ratified treaties may be directly applicable as soon as they are ratified, to the extent that even if an implementing legislation is adopted, it would probably define just the nitty-gritties of specific treaties, but of course, those treaties would already be of direct application. And while on the other side, the common law, countries from a common law regime would particularly need to have laws adopted for the regional commitments to be into place. Secondly, also from a constitutional point of view, in many common law countries, the right to safe environment, for instance, being an economic and social right, would be part of the general principles of state policy, and therefore not being directly enforceable. So we will basically try and accommodate all these sensitivities to ensure that the model law is used by all members of the African Union. Thirdly, the consideration of legislative status for some instruments, because in some countries, legislation has been mainly being done by parliament as a primary legislation. While in other African countries, we will see the instruments mainly going towards secondary legislation. And on issues to do with environment, we'll probably have a decree or a decree law enacted by the executive. And in all those circumstances, we'll try and accommodate to ensure that whether in a particular country, the drive is to go the secondary legislative way, the contents of the model law and the core principles would still be able to be used and transposed in whatever format. And lastly, the language. We will also try to make sure that the language is flexible and capable of being contextualized, given the fact that the climate change issues and area is very technical, and we need to be mindful of the language, but also when translating the world instrument into other languages, we need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes you may lose the strength or the sensibility of a specific provision. So all these considerations, next slide, would lead us to ensure that the framework, the model itself, assume that climate change policies anchored in legislation will have to give effect to commitment of states under international law, but also under their constitutions. Secondly, they should provide enough guidance to for countries in the development of both primary or secondary legislation on climate change and other related matters. Thirdly, to contain technical issues in the area of climate change that may be governed by 2 or more pieces of legislation, even though the preference would be for a more comprehensive model law, which would cater for all aspects of climate change. And lastly, they should have the necessary flexibility for adaptation to the needs of specific countries, but also to the various contexts. As I said before, the resolution on the model law, next slide, and I think it's my last slide, was adopted in June 2023, but the push for it started even many years ago, probably even before COVID. And the Committee on Agriculture was able to endorse this proposal and submit it to plenary. And following the adoption, here we are to ensure that at least even the first steps of reflecting on this model law can be informed by views from the citizens and various stakeholders, including civil society on the continent. And following this meeting, we will have a policy framework and a zero draft of the model law, which, if we work day and night, we will be able to present to the Committee on Rural, to the Committee on Agriculture for consideration, and the committee will take it forward to plenary for consideration and adoption. Once it is adopted in plenary, it will open another window for consultations, which may be regional consultations, or sometimes we organize technical consultations, particularly if the topic is very technical. And the views from the consultation will further inform the draft for a second submission to the committee, and the committee will submit it to plenary for consideration and adoption. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable members of Parliament, this is my presentation, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Clement, for really walking us through that stimulating presentation that clearly provides for how the whole process is anchored within the processes of Pan-African Parliament, and more usefully also giving us a flair of what is the intended output in terms of the law, what kind of purposes should it serve, and also giving us an indication of the territoriality around which this law, the landscape within which this law should be applied, and what that means in terms of militating some certain aspects. But I think you provided us with quite a rich background on the legal and policy underpinnings that inform this particular law, both within the Parliament itself, outside the Parliament, and also borrowing on global instruments at all levels, and also throwing some certain jumps into our works to look at then how that law is meant to be situated, particularly in other mosaics of laws within country context. I think that was quite a rich background, and you ended by sort of giving us an indication of the roadmap and where our process plugs and why this process is extremely important. I think, honorable members, that has been quite a stimulating presentation, and we have to appreciate it. I know you have questions. We will still come back to those questions. I know you have observations, you have comments. I would encourage we pack them, and then we tie another equally important and in the related presentation, which is actually on exploring the climate law landscape in Africa, and our own, the guru of climate change, the guy who saw it as conversations were beginning. He usually tells me that time he was a young boy, but now Angie is really catching up with him, but he has all the history with him, can help us situate all these conversations within the wider context. We have Professor Seth Osafo. Professor Seth Osafo is a legal advisor, African Group of Negotiators. Let's give him an applause as he takes the stage. Really to now begin to detail and demonstrate to us where the hooks are. Over to you, Prof, for your insights. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, and very good afternoon. You all honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, PAGJA colleagues and friends. Thank you once again to PAGJA and PAP for asking me to share with you some insights as to how you proceed from the adoption of a treaty to its implementation at the domestic level. There are a number of processes that one goes through. We don't go to sleep. The adoption process is followed by ratification. And by ratification, we mean that the content of the treaty should be accepted by the parties for implementation. It means, therefore, that after the negotiations and the treaty adopted, the ratification process begins at the national level. And that begins when the ministry or the department that took the lead at the national level in the negotiation process would prepare an instrument that will go through some processes. In some cases, the treaty will go to Parliament. They will consider its contents. Even though it's been negotiated, Parliament has to look at it and be satisfied that this is a treaty that they want to be party to for their country. After Parliament has approved the treaty, it then goes to the executive. Then the executive will sign the proposals that have been submitted to Parliament and approved by them. And then from the executive, sometimes it goes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or it goes to some other department or ministry. And then it's signed by the head of state, and then it is forwarded to the depository. Now, in the case of the Climate Change Convention, the depository is the United Nations Secretary General's Office of Legal Affairs. So that is transmitted from the capital, or sometimes they pass it through the UN mission in New York. But depending on where the treaty is, if it's not climate change, it will have the depository somewhere else. But for climate change, the depository is New York. And this has to be transmitted either directly from the capital or from the permanent mission of that country in New York. Treaty ratification is a specialized instrument, which either goes to the Ministry of Justice or to the Foreign Affairs. But that's how the process that it goes through. And we go through this process at the national level simply because you are going to adopt the contents of that treaty for implementation at the national level. So it means that after the negotiations of the treaty that we normally have in Bonn, in New York, Geneva, Nairobi, where after the adoption is completed, then the process of implementation begins. So it's no use ratifying a treaty and being a party to that treaty without implementation of the commitments and obligations at the national level. This as the implementation at the national level that we want to look at this afternoon. So climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing mankind in the 21st century. And it's quite obvious to us all with what is happening around the world. We're experiencing drought. We're experiencing flooding. We're experiencing heat waves. And I could go on and on. And we are seeing it now happening in almost every country. Now, the impacts of climate change are evident, not only developing countries, but also in developed countries. Recently, we've heard of heat waves in Spain, Portugal, parts of Southern Europe. Even in UK, they are seeing temperatures they have not seen before, in Germany and other places. So it's happening everywhere. But the fact is that for us in the South and in Africa, we said it, you've heard it over and over again, that Africa is the continent that is most vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. And we are affected the most, even though we say that we have contributed very little to the global problem that we have. Africa has contributed just about 4% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. But then we are feeling its impact the most. For that reason, we also need to ensure that we adapt because it's going to continue. Even though we intend stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions concentrations in the atmosphere at a certain level, but it's not coming so soon. So we have to adapt and learn to live with the impacts of climate change. And so the appropriate environment and strategies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to its adverse impacts should continue. And we should build resilience. If we don't build resilience, we are in big trouble. And that's why we need the legislation at the national level that will translate our international obligations under the Climate Change Convention to national action in order to protect us. Climate change will compound as we see existing economic and social problems of countries. It's happening. I mean, if you have a cyclone, a tornado that destroys a lot of infrastructure in your country, you will have to divert money from development to address those challenges. And I think they are facing it in Malawi right now with a cyclone that destroyed a lot of things. And not only there, in places like Kenya, also where there are serious cases of drought, and other countries, government has to divert resources from infrastructure, economic development to address the emergencies that its own people are facing. So climate change is going to compound existing economic and social problems. And therefore, appropriate action must be taken at the international, domestic, and local government levels. And as such, it is important that national development programs include policies and measures to adapt to climate change. The traditional practice over the years has been to develop and enact domestic legislation after an international agreement, as I've explained, to provide a basis for domestic action. Now, looking at the African context, there are very few countries that have laws or regulations on climate change in their law books, and more so in reference to the Climate Change Convention, to the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement provides that it leads it to each party. Nobody can compel a country. It leads to each party to decide on what measures it will take at the national level. And it depends on the country. Each country can do it differently. The Paris Agreement goes further and adopts the bottom-up approach by which the parties will be prepared and communicate their national development contributions to the Secretariat, stating the level by which they will reduce emissions. Now, there is some difference between the Climate Change Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. Under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, it provides provisions that allows countries to implement their commitments at the national level. And then you come to the Kyoto Protocol, and that provides targets, specific targets of emission reduction for the developed countries. Now, if you've ever seen or read the Kyoto Protocol, its commitments refer only to developed countries. No developing country has an obligation under the Kyoto Protocol. But then now we move on to the Paris Agreement, and Paris Agreement has a different dimension. I don't have time to go behind the Kyoto Protocol. But the reason why we got the Paris Agreement was that there were some developed countries, major countries, who were not interested or did not want to be subjected to the targets that are contained in that protocol. They said, look, we don't want targets. We want to be free to make our own contributions. And so they started agitating for a new treaty that will enable every country to determine how it can contribute to addressing climate change impacts at the global level. And so that's why we have the Paris Agreement, and it allows every country, big or small, to determine how it is going to address, contribute to addressing the impacts of climate change. So no country has a target. But then, by 2016, every country that is a party to the Climate Change Convention and to the Paris Agreement was expected to submit its nationally determined contributions. And what it means is that you provide a document that covers what you can do to contribute to climate change, domestic action. And so we have these nationally determined contributions that almost every country that is a party to the Paris Agreement has submitted. I think I said it yesterday, or maybe I said it somewhere. But the fact is that for Africa, we had some challenges. Preparation of nationally determined contributions was something new to us. We didn't have the expertise in most cases, and it was going to be quite a challenge for us. So some donors gratuitously provided us with consultants to help us prepare our nationally determined contributions. Some were very helpful, but some went overboard. And now, if you look at the nationally determined contributions of some countries, you would realize that they have pledged to do more than they are capable of doing. But it's there. So, the country has to prepare and communicate its nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, to the Secretariat to show what it can do. Now, issues such as loss and damage, which has become a critical issue now, and reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, have been addressed for the first time in the Paris Agreement, and parties are obliged to take action on these to protect our forests. Now, several have already adopted national policies. I mean, for many countries, before they proceed to adopt legislation, they first adopt the national policy on climate change. And it is on that basis that the legislation is adopted. But then it could be, and it's happening in some countries, that they have adopted their national policy on climate change, and basically that is their law. They have decided that they will not go the next step to have a legislation, but the policies that they have will guide them. And it's their prerogative. Let me just there. Okay. Okay. Now let's look at the situation as it exists in our countries. And in fact, if you do an assessment of some of the legislation that we have on our statute books, some of them date back to the colonial era. They are so old, and the issues they deal are so old that they haven't changed much, but the situation has changed. And so for Africa, and I think other countries, many countries already have legislation, but it is not comprehensive legislation that deals with climate change exclusively. It scatters across several sectors and institutions of government, making the implementation and monitoring of the laws rather difficult. Now, you know that climate change is a very complex subject. And the contents of climate change also vary a lot. But then in dealing with them, there's a need for comprehensive population and addressing them in a holistic manner. You have different sectors, and I think Clement mentioned a number of them. You've got forestry, you've got water resources, you've got waste management, you've got air pollution. I mean, I could go on and on. Now, all these subjects relate to climate change. And you may find them in different laws, as has been done in the past. And then you get the institutions. You get the Ministry of Forestry being responsible for forests. Ministry of Energy, responsible for energy issues. And somehow they act independently. There's lack of coordination among the ministries and institutions. And if a government wants to move forward and legislate on climate change, it will have to opt for one of three approaches. And the options are offered here. So you have the problem where the old system, where responsibility is scattered among various ministries. Sometimes even they do not cooperate. Each one is doing its own thing. Ministry of Forestry is acting on its own. Ministry of Lands acts on its own. The Ministry of Local Government, or the ministry responsible for waste management, acts on its own. There's hardly any coordination among the ministries. And so a country ought to decide how it wants to act. And it's the prerogative of the country. they may decide that we want to continue with the existing system. We will have facets of climate change administered by different departments and institutions and different laws as they are. And so it could be possibly done that it is scattered all over. And then a country may decide that it wants to develop an overall framework law that is designed in such a way as to provide an overarching legal framework that will facilitate the implementation of government policies on climate change. So you have a framework legislation. The framework legislation has been defined as a law or regulation with equivalent status, which serves as a comprehensive, unifying basis for climate change policy, which addresses the multiple aspects or areas of climate change mitigation and adaptation, or both, in a very holistic manner. Okay, so that's what a framework legislation that addresses climate change comprehensively. It looks at the various aspects and they come up with a framework law. And then the other way that you can deal with the issue is to amend existing sectoral legislation. And I've already touched on a number of them. You can amend and strengthen existing legislation relating to climate change with a view to bringing them in conformity with current developments in the area of climate change. So you let the existing sectoral legislation exist, but you amend them to bring them in line with current developments or in line with your commitments under the convention and the protocol. Now, many laws and regulations would already exist for the protection of the environment and sectors such as energy, transport, forestry, and water resources management. In most countries, you will already have this on your statute books. Now, a government could, for instance, amend its existing energy law to introduce energy measures, energy efficient measures that would make the generation, distribution, and use of energy more efficient. It could also introduce provisions for promoting the development and use of renewable energy. So all this could go into the existing legislation that would be amended. In case of transportation, road traffic regulations could be amended to introduce emission reduction standards that will prevent old vehicles from emitting excessive smoke from their exhaust. We see a lot of them on our roads, belching black smoke, and it affects health, causes big problems. So if we don't have legislation on transport that reduces emissions, then it means that we have to introduce this. Now, some countries have a system in place where every vehicle is inspected at least once or twice a year. Different measures have been adopted, but in order to reduce emissions from the transport sector, you need to put in place emission reduction targets. Amending existing legislation could be a long and painful process, as it will involve the piecemeal and systematic amendment of many different laws. So you have to address this law on transport, address this for transport on energy, address this legislation on forests, and so on and so forth. It's a long, painstaking process. However, the benefits that such changes could bring would not be limited to climate change issues only, but will extend to other areas of the national economy. So whilst bringing legislation in line with climate change, advantage could be taken to address other sectors as well. so as to make legislation more effective. Now, thirdly, let me go on to change in an existing comprehensive related legislation. There could be, again, laws, yes, possibly climate change in intent, but then you have to introduce certain sectors that were not there before. And it could include some environmental provisions as well. So these are the approaches that are available for addressing climate change issues at the national level in domestic legislation. Now, let me take you, as I conclude, quickly to some of the provisions of elements that you will find in a comprehensive climate change law. Part one, definitely you will need to look at the constitutional provisions. And I think Clement mentioned that Constitution will surely provide for the protection of human rights, environment, health, and so on and so forth. So there could be a provision in the Constitution that provides the basis for developing such a law. What is the objective of that law? To address the adverse impacts of climate change, any language, but it should relate to addressing climate change impacts, to reducing emissions, and that country contributing its bit towards addressing climate change at the international level, because that is the basis where you started from. So whatever you do at the national level should contribute to the global effort to address climate change. And then, of course, you need to get definitions in the law, which is a must for every law. And then you have to look at institutional arrangements. What institutions need to be put in place? A department, a commission, a council. It depends on what the country wants to do. And you definitely need an institution to be responsible for the implementation of that law. The objectives must be clearly stated. There should be the functions and responsibilities of the department or ministry responsible for climate change. Interestingly, there are a few countries around the globe who have ministries responsible for climate change and maybe something else. So what functions are you going to give them? Now, which ministry are they going to report to? The ministry that is responsible. So you are putting up a comprehensive law that addresses climate change impacts. Part three, it's always helpful for climate change coming on board to have a fund to address climate change impact. Well, the budget can contribute it, yes. But what we found in a number of countries is that they have established a fund to which contributions could be made by the private sector, people exploiting natural resources, and so on and so forth, exporting timber and other things. So the fund is established so that they make a contribution towards that fund, and that could be used to address climate change concerns. The objective of the fund will definitely be stated. The sources, I've tried to name a few, but they are not all that I want to talk about. And then the management and functions of the fund, because you have to set up an administrative body that will administer the fund, and its management and functions will have to be stated. Now, some of the elements: adaptation measures to reduce vulnerability to climate change. What actions are you going to take to protect vulnerability of the people of that country, of that particular community? Climate change as it relates to food security because its effect definitely affect food security. If there is drought in an area, what do? So food security is a big issue. And of course, agriculture and crop diversification. So you need to look at agriculture, how climate change is impacting it, and what measures and steps need to be taken to address this. With crop diversification, the little I know is that sometimes with climate change and the movement from forest areas to savanna and dry areas, you need to decide where you are going to plant certain crops now. Because if they were not doing well, or if they were doing well in an area, and with climate change, it's getting warmer, and you have to move production from that area to another area, it's important that you look at those aspects as well. And then, of course, health and social protection. Climate change will affect health. It will affect the livelihoods of people, the poor and marginal people, and you need to address that also in the legislation. And then we need to educate the public and our people and to create awareness and enhancement of technical cooperation. Now, yesterday, when I was here, the question of rights of children came up. How does climate change affect children? Adversely. How does it affect women? Our mothers are the ones who go to the farms and who are affected the most by the adverse effects of climate change. We need to educate them. Someone after the meeting in a discussion said, we should be teaching children in schools about the impacts of climate change, to tell them about the importance of protecting and planting trees. Now, if you educate the child at that stage, it will definitely carry it on. Another important area that needs to be looked at, water storage, water efficiency, and prioritization. Again, water is crucial to life. It's been said that water is life. So it's important that we protect our water bodies, we learn to store water, and to use water efficiently. UNEP has been promoting conservation of water by catching rainwater. There are many places. I mean, when I was a child, catching rainwater on the roof was a must. Our parents would put barrels together. Some of them would possibly make underground tanks so that the water that comes from the rain is not wasted, but it could be used for future purposes. And so water storage, water is becoming a crucial issue as far as our lives are concerned. So we need to use it efficiently. Sustainable coastal management, again, our coastlines need to be protected. Now, in some places, we get sand from the seashore. So that's what we use for construction. We go, we collect the sand and collect it and build houses. At the end of the day, the sea keeps coming inland because the protection is gone. And so we need to manage our coastal zones efficiently. Recently, it's been found all over the globe that plastic waste flows into the sea. And some of our beaches have been ruined by plastic and other wastes. How do we address this? How do we ensure that people do not go to the beach, have a good time, and leave the plastic bottles there? These are issues, very simple issues, but that we need to look at. And then we need improved early warning system. Are the rains going to come? When will they come? Shouldn't we be prepared? Shouldn't our farmers be informed that this year the rains might come late? Maybe they will not come at all. And so we need to prepare. And early warning systems help us to address this. Disaster preparedness and management of infrastructure. How do we deal with disaster? There will be disasters, whether we like it or not. Do we have institutions that are ready and prepared in cases of disaster and emergencies to address those disasters that have come? Reduction of deforestation and protection of forests. That is absolutely crucial. In a continent where we depend on firewood to cook, to bake, we cut the trees indiscriminately because we don't have any other source. If you go to the rural areas, well, I think now the use of gas is catching on. But for most of us, we grew up in an environment where I even had to go to the farm. My mother will cut the firewood. We will carry it home. And that is what we use for cooking. But by so doing, gradually, we were depleting the forests. And so we need to protect the forest. And this need to be taken into account in our legislation. Loss and damage. I think we've said a lot about it. Mitigation. We need, at least, even though we are contributing only 4%, at least let us make the effort to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Our little bit. And I would say that in some cases, in the effort to mitigate, you actually benefit from it. I spoke about cars, buses, trucks emitting smoke on our roads. If we can control this, it helps with health. And we know that when a truck is belching smoke, there must be something mechanically wrong. So definitely, if they can look at the engine and make it perform effectively, it will possibly consume less fuel. And it saves money. So there are certain actions that we can take to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change. And then low carbon development. But that is becoming jargon, a slogan. But our development process should ensure that it reduces carbon into the atmosphere. And maybe we could be using less and less. I've mentioned nationally determined contributions because we are, if a country is a party to the Paris Agreement, it has an obligation to provide its nationally determined contributions in its report to the Climate Change Secretariat for consideration by the parties. And this is the mandate for that to be done. And then industrial processes also ought to be looked at. Do you get to use more efficient machines in the industrial process? Do you also have to ensure that you use renewable energy, solar system, to reduce electricity consumption? And there are a number of ways where industries have changed from using electricity from the grid to using renewable sources of energy like solar. And they save money and it works a lot for them. So that also ought to be looked at in the legislation. Energy and renewables, which I've just spoken about. And then waste disposal. In many of our cities, waste disposal has become a big problem. But there are ways by which waste disposal can be addressed. And modern ways that can be done. In fact, some countries, I don't know how we can do it in Africa, but they separate waste. Biodegradable, this and that. And then they will go and process them. And in some places, they use the treatment of waste to generate energy. These are options that we could also look at. Economic and physical incentives for people to use methods that help reduce climate change emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Then we also need an inspection and monitoring system. There's no use putting in place a law where you don't inspect, where you don't monitor how you are doing. You just leave it. No, need to monitor an inspection. And sometimes it puts fear into people. Again, let me use my own example. When I was a kid, we had a system in our towns and villages where we had inspectors. They will come unannounced to your house, check the water in the barrel, look at how you have managed things, whether you are living in debt or you are being able to clean up things. And if you were not living in accordance with the bylaws of that community, they could fine you or they could take you to the court. Inspection and monitoring, and then offenses and penalties that if you impose, I mean, we are people such that unless you impose penalties for offenses committed, we will not stop. And so again, this ought to be done. And then there should be a place where they could lodge complaints. If I have a complaint against a department or an institution that is responsible for managing the environment, I should be able to go and say that this is not being done. If the waste for which I'm being paid for is not being collected, where can I go and lodge a complaint? So these are possibilities that exist, should exist in the law, and then settlement of disputes in areas. And then also, we should have regulations and orders. The law should make provision for regulations and orders that go into detail in implementing the law. So, ladies and gentlemen, on this note, I'll end my presentation, and I hope we can go ahead and develop comprehensive laws or amending SACRA, whichever way the government wish to go to address climate change in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Seth. I think that was quite elaborate, building from where Clement left, in terms of looking at how to domesticate international instrument, but also doing a quite a critique of how you really position it within the context of the country, given the mosaic of other laws that could be in existence within the country. And again, that process that he has actually taken us through on ratification is extremely important, and domestication of the laws within national spaces, because sometimes some of those processes are not again triggered internally. And again, we have also seen cases within some southern states where the parliamentary process in the whole process is not as strong as it should be. And I think that's useful. I think he's gone through all the elements in a very sequential manner of how the Mondial law should look like and what it should actually touch. And that was quite useful. I want to basically capture elements that were resounding, both from the presentation of Clement and the presentation of our Prof. And one of the elements that was quite resonating across is the overarching recognition of the right to health and a clean environment for citizens. That seems to be like an anchoring element, trying to look at the right to health and clean environment and how that is actually progressively being advanced as extremely critical. But equally, we've also seen that right, even within the international instruments, other efforts being made, even to hold corporates accountable in terms of realizing the right to health and clean environment. And I think that becomes extremely central in the entire process. And then I think there is the international instruments related to climate change and how they are actually landing or falling within the context of Africa, which again is extremely a useful reference point in terms of developing the law or the model law that we are basically looking into. Both presentation in a larger way then speak about grounded elements to the policy, to the law development process, looking at what best practices are there on one side, but also looking on the other side, what are the national actions that should be implemented at all levels. So that's elements of grounding the law itself. So that again, it's not hanging in air, but also addressing quite pertinent issues for communities at the front line. I think that's quite an important element. But again, there is overall recognition that you could have one common law, but you could equally build on other existing sets of laws to create a strong legal piece. So I want to pause there and open it to the floor to receive. I usually like receiving comments first and build up observations. And then I come to specifics in terms of questions. So I like first beginning with comments, people with substantive comments on those presentations to take the space, provide those comments, because we are co-creating this together in the spirit of us creating the broad frame for the law. So I'm first welcoming people with observation, and then we come to specifics in terms of questions. So over to you, people with, anybody with comment that needs to be factored in this particular process. That is where I'll begin. Then I'll come to questions. The panelists will not escape questions, but we want first to harness your thoughts. Over to you. Allow me to start right at the back. Honorable Jacqueline.
Okay, thank you so much, Clement, for taking us through the framework, the proposed, and also Professor for taking us through the nitty-gritties in regards to coming up with a model law on climate change in Africa. And I think this is very timely and should have started actually yesterday. But the most important thing is to get started. The one thing I want us to do research on as we are championing this model law is to look at our regions, the four regions of Africa, the five regions of Africa, and also the speciality of the different countries. And then look at the gaps that are available in their legislations within the different countries. Like I said yesterday, already in Africa, less than 4 countries already have a climate change law. And therefore, if we are doing a draft, a model law, because I know when the Pan-African Parliament comes up with a model law, it's not mandatory that it will be implemented. It is like a guiding model, which can be replicated in another parliament to be passed as an act, as a bill, and finally as an act of parliament. So now that we have Kenya, actually Kenya was among the first countries to come up with an act of parliament, then Uganda, then Ethiopia, and I think recently Nigeria. So there is need, as we even look at the model, to look at those countries that have come up with a law, who have a law in place, and then all the other 49 plus countries that don't have anything in regards to climate change in their legislation in terms of having a climate change law at the national level. So that has to be looked at. And then two, there's also now a need to see whether those existing countries, whether those laws still stand the test of the time or need to be revamping. So this model law will help even to address those gaps if we are to come up with a standard modern model law which can be replicable in the different member parliaments. And then, of course, this law does not, we also need to have done research or to continue doing research on the different sectors within our national parliaments. For example, correlating the climate change with the other sectors. We are talking about mainstreaming climate change in all our legislations, because despite the fact that we'll come up with a model law, within that there is need for a mention on the interrelation between agriculture. A country may not necessarily have a standalone model law, a standalone climate change law, but it could be having a good law in the agriculture, which still correlates to addressing climate, for example, climate smart, and a law in a particular country. Food and nutrition, it's a law in a particular country. Some countries have the certification and drought. So there's need to relate now this climate change model law, plus all the active sectors that we think are relevant and work closely with addressing climate change issues. And then we will come up with a smart law. For us as members in the Eastern African region, and also from the different parliaments, we will be very much interested in working with the Pan-African Parliament to have a smart law, and we'll have this also replicated in the Eastern region. For example, if the East African Parliament passes an act of a climate change act of parliament, which is now at the draft stage, it automatically becomes replicable in the countries it is for implementation. So to me, I think this is a very good pace that the Pan-African Parliament is taking. And it's in terms of comments, I think this is something that we need as a country, because this law will help us even address all these multilateral instruments that we are sent to at the different platforms, but actually domestication is still very lacking. And then later implementation, when the law is in a country, will be easier, because then there is already a beginning framework. So I think those are the comments I wanted to make. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Honorable Jacqueline. We will, if you have any question, we'll still come to that particular level. But right now, we want first to consolidate the inputs. I want to first move to Honorable Passaris, and I'll still come to you. Honorable Passaris, you have the floor. The one next to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to all the contributors. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, you touched on almost everything that we've been discussing at the Pan-African Parliament. I am the Member of Parliament for Nairobi County, and I also am one of Kenya's representatives at the Pan-African Parliament, and I'm in the Rural Economy, Agriculture, Natural Resources and Environment Committee. You know, one of the biggest challenges that we have as the continent of Africa is our over-dependence on the global north. And when I say over-dependence on the global north, it's because even when we're looking for carbon credits, we feel that we are the weak link and they are the ones who are going to compensate us. So how do we talk tough when we also need them to give us the resources to be able to grow whatever it is that we need to? For instance, if we're looking at land and we want to grow mangrove, or we want to grow bamboo, or we want to increase our tree coverage, the starting point, then knowing how much we are supposed to, what is our carbon credit at that particular time, the stock, and then what is the compensation that is due. We're finding that a lot of Western companies have already started coming in and exploiting us. So it's like colonization of everything. They colonized us in terms of our people, then they colonized us in terms of our minerals and our resources, and now they're colonizing us even on carbon credits, where we're trying to breathe and survive. Because all that, as you said, 4% of the emissions are from Africa. The rest is from the global north. So the question is, I've been sitting down and cracking my head and thinking, how can we be on the table as equals and demand that they compensate us what is rightfully ours, right? And then also give us the kind of money that we need, not that if it's a Western company, you know, when they give us aid, they always tell us use our contractors, and basically the money still stays with them. So I'm looking at what can we do? And I was thinking, the West is already producing, for instance, transport, Tesla, the electric vehicle. There is already an opportunity for anyone that's producing emissions and has to buy the carbon credits to buy them from their own existing companies. So what can we as Africa do? So if you have airlines like British Airways, Lufthansa coming and landing into the continent of Africa, you know that they produce emissions, you know that they have to buy carbon credits, and we demand that for you to land in our continent, you've got to buy our carbon credits. So I think we need to have a two-tone approach where when we're looking at our carbon credits production, we as the continent of Africa have always got to stop this idea that we cannot survive without the West. I think it's about time that we start putting our own value in ourselves, you know, and develop that stature as a continent that we have what it takes to demand certain things. And I love the fact that we've got President Ruto as the chair of the Environment Committee for the African Union. And the reason why I like that is because he's talking tough. And I remember the whispers when he made his talk at the Pan-African Parliament. Everybody was like, oh my God, he sounds like Gaddafi wanting this united Africa. Is he going to be safe? I think those days of people not being safe because they speak out about our rights, you know, the rights for Africa to enjoy its resources first come, right, are long overdue. And we should not be apologetic about that. We're not beggars when we go into the platform of the global north. We are actually demanding what is rightfully there for Africa. And I think now we need to look at who are the companies that are buying carbon credits and how can we tell them that you have to buy it from us at the same rate that you buy it from your Western companies, right? Because this idea, I remember even President Ruto mentioning the fact that when we borrow money because we're supposed to be high risk from funders like World Bank, IMF, we pay so much more, right? So of course they stifle us so that we're not able to actually pay our loans with ease because they give us such high rates of interest because we're supposed to allegedly high risk. So I think there's a way that we need to think outside of the box on how to revive the pride of Africa, the pride of being Black, you know, the pride of owning our own resources and standing up for our rights, because the resources of Africa have to benefit the African continent and the African people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Passaris. I think that is powerful. So you are inviting the people developing the law to, in a very substantive manner, extend the agenda of decolonization, freeing of Africa and freeing of resources within Africa, within the mondial law itself. That is what I'm hearing in a resounding manner. And I know Ndidi over there, Dr. Ndidi is actually noting, and my brother is also noting that we must be sufficiently radical in our proposition within the mondial law. So I want to move to, everyone will speak. No worries, don't be in a hurry. Don't be in a hurry. Where is the mic? I want to see where is the mic. Augustine, are you the one with the mic? I wanted to pick Honorable and introduce yourself. Why I don't get your name? The names for ladies come first, unfortunately. Honorable ladies, they usually come first.
Thank you very much. My name is Honorable Omar Mwinyi. member for Changamwe constituency in Mombasa County, and have been an ardent follower of this subject. And I've even happened to have attended the COP26 in Glasgow. And ever since I've been interested, of course, in this subject. My contribution towards the presentation by Professor and the other gentleman is we need also to involve our experts in enacting of our laws, because these are ever working and they are ever meeting with the other counterparts in the other countries in coming up with means and ways of mitigating and even trying to position ourselves in doing the right things. So I think as members of parliament, we need to incorporate their views in coming up with the proper laws. And in addition to that, we also need to bring on board other experts in perhaps economic and other areas, so that we also become self-sufficient in running our economies. Because at the moment we have a problem as a continent. And the problem we have is we do not know how to use our resources properly. And that is why perhaps the West is adamant in giving us those resources, because they know once given to us, they perhaps half of it or even 3/4 of it may disappear into our pockets. Perhaps we should now be in a position to know that we need to run our finances properly and prudently. And since we have experts, let us use these experts. Sometimes we as politicians want to believe that we know everything, and we end up messing our countries. So my plea is to involve experts in all our dealings, because they are the ones who are running the show. When we are busy doing other things, they are busy meeting from January to December. So I am pleading with our members, the Pan-African members and other members, of course, to involve our experts in coming up with proper laws, in trying to come up with our own independence. And perhaps if we do that, we may achieve something maybe in the next few years. Otherwise, if we are only waiting to be compensated, to be given funds, we may not do anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honorable. I remember you were inviting me for an event in Mombasa. Now I can recall, but we will be able to take that up. But I think usefully you are underpinning elements around accountability. Can I bring Augustine? I can see he's about to jump up. Augustine, you want to come in? And I think that would be useful, because Honorable Omar has actually directed us to harness also a bit of technical expertise within the room. I want to tap on two more expert elements and then return back to members of parliament.
Thank you so much. And I thank you for the presentation, and thank you, Prof. I just wanted to follow up from where Honorable ended. She said we needed to be, bold enough to take things into our own hands. As a young lawyer, when I started my career, we had this experience. There's this AU model law on the protection of rights of local communities, farmers, breeders, and for the regulation of access to biological resources, which was championed by Professor John Epere. For those who know him, he's one of the best AU has had in plant genetic material dialogues. So this was produced with a lot of consultations, and it fits the context of this continent. But as any other laudable African initiative, it was kind of demonized. Each time you stood up and you wanted to mention that, others, you know what the others that I'm talking about? You mean that AU thing? You mean that OAU thing? You know, that kind of thing. Until our countries were shy enough to buy into that rhetoric. So for climate change, ladies and gentlemen, members of parliament, unless and until we are willing to take this as our own and have that spirit of making Africa to stand up and be respected, we'll develop a model law that will sound so sweet in our ears, and that each country will despise it and go and do something that will please others except us. This is just a sound of caution that I have for us. But otherwise, a model law remains a model that you take and domesticate according to your own local context. But at least certain principles, like Prof was talking about, should be there if it has to give meaning to our people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Augustine, for the word of caution. I know this is one of that law, and even as domesticated within international instrument, is one of the laws that is seriously under attack every time. And therefore, the key thing and the key consideration is how do we also insulate the law? The ownership element is extremely important, but how do we also insulate it from attacks? Because the climate change law, whichever you will create, if it's sufficiently strong, it will be a serious target. Let me go to Honorable Member of Parliament from Ghana, and then I come to the floor. I come to the front. You will all speak, don't worry.
Thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Mafo, an MP from Ghana. I chair the Global Parliamentary Group of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. I'm not part of PAP, but I just want to provide few reflections for our benefit, especially inspired by the statement that a Kenyan lady MP made. I just want us to rethink this whole assignment that we have taken for ourselves in the context of the global climate politics. Now, the Paris Agreement, to what extent are we working towards making it justiciable or making it enforceable? I know that the UN has passed a resolution asking the International Court of Justice to provide opinion on that, because we cannot and we should not, as a continent, worry ourselves trying to pass laws at the local level when at the international level, where things matter, where the greater emitters and those who are benefiting from the current and just economic order are just pushing for voluntarism, that let everything be whatever we let everything be on voluntary basis but when it comes to country level, let it be legally enforceable. If we are talking about enforceability, then the Paris Agreement, we must go first and ask, why is it that we are not enforcing the Paris Agreement? Why is it that people who are polluting more, who have deposited their NDCs, saying that these are their commitments to reduce emissions, they are not obliging, they are not, complying. And at the global level, we are playing it like everything is voluntary. But then we are coming down to those of us, all of us here collectively contributing about 4% to the crisis. And then we say that, no, let us tighten and make our laws enforceable. We need to rethink this whole idea. I mean, I'm enthused about the law. I think it is good that we have a legislative framework that will guide our operations. But hey, that is just to enforce what? A problem that you are contributing 4% to, whilst the bigger issues are there. And I'm just challenging PAP that use your platform to demand, probably as part of the resolution, to say that we want a speedy response to the UN resolution, to the International Court of Justice on the enforceability of the Paris Agreement, because that is what matters most. If we are able to enforce the Paris Agreement, I mean, whether Africa has a law on climate change or not, the problems will be solved, because the greater part of the problems are coming from elsewhere. And so that is the angle that I would like to come with. My last comment will be that it is good that we have a model law, but we should not also forget that within countries, parliamentarians need to stand for the things that we believe in and capture the space that belongs to us. I come to a conclusion that the whole climate space has been hijacked by the executive. In many of our countries, when there is a COP or there's any conference, if the executive does not choose to call you an MP to be part of the delegation, sometimes you have a delegation of 50 or 20 people from one country, there's no MP, because the control of resources is within the purview of the executive. And so we need to go back and make sure that we don't go and pass a law that at the end of the day will also give more powers to the executive, and they forget that Parliament must also take our place in the climate space and make sure that we are participating not only at the country level, but also at the continental level. We should not forget that. In Ghana, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency is the custodian of the bill, the climate change bill. And now they want to make it as an amendment of their act. So the existing EPA law should be amended to capture climate change issues. Parliament committee is saying that no, we must have a separate climate change issue. But at the end of the day, you will not be surprised if at the end of the day you have that the will of the executive, as it were, prevailing, because sometimes we forget our position in the scheme of things, and then we leave the executive to have their way. So I think we need to have critical reflections on the things we are doing if we want Africa to indeed have our right place. I thank you.
Thank you so much, honorable member. And even if we ended the conversation at that level, we would have captured quite a gist. But the spirit of the conversation in Midrand is actually vibrating inside you. In reclaiming the space, I think it's high time to see then how do we also quickly galvanize as parliamentarians, honorable members, to be in the fore in terms of driving the agenda. But I also want to capture something that highlight something that captured my attention as you were speaking. The pursuit of global justice by members of parliament from Africa has not been strong, if at all it has been there. I know in other places, members of parliament have been able to veto processes and even block processes which are not in their best interests. But we are not seeing equivocal action from African continents in regard to the same. So that's something that we need first and foremost to reflect on. And if looking at collectivity of all the actors, we are able to do it together, then how can we move forward as a team? I know even right now as we speak, the loss and damage agenda hangs in balance. And the conversation within the transitional committee on loss and damage is not actually heading in the right direction. How are we able as members of parliament to take our weight and be able even to leverage on our relationships across the globe to ensure that there is a parliamentarian uprising across the world in furtherance of that agenda? We have loss and damage pledge that is coming immediately after the African Climate Summit, which will be driven by members of parliament, is part of the effort, but the pursuit of justice within the UNFCCC mechanism is extremely important. Now, we seek justice outside, which is the second point that resonated with me. We seek justice outside. Probably it's high time we begin to reflect on what is the status of our justice institutions within Africa, and how can we strengthen them to deliver this justice. That could be probably a much more broader agenda, which we need to come into later. Let me shift to the back. I know, Nicholas, your hand is getting tired. I shift to you, Nicholas, Dr. Nicholas. Then I come to the front, and then in the middle.
Thank you so much, Philip, for the opportunity. I'm not a member of parliament, so I'll be very brief. So I have
you are at liberty to give us details that will enable us prosecute the matter.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the presentation that was made by Professor Osofo, very substantive. But I think there are three important things that were missing that are quite critical to the continent as we know it now. We know that climate change is causing displacement and is also leading to migration. And we have seen the death of Africans in the Mediterranean. We have seen the mistreatment of Africans in Tunisia. And we have also seen the death of Africans, especially in the border, Ethiopia, and the deaths in the context of Saudi Arabia. But we have not included a section that has to deal with the displacement and migration as a component of the model law. I think this is very important. The second thing, and I thought our member of parliament for Nairobi was going to pick it up, is the importance of the urban space and the climate, the effect of climate change in the urban space, especially because of the increasing urban poverty and the reality that the majority of the people who migrate from the rural areas into the cities go to live in the marginal areas that are exposed to the adverse effects of climate change, be it flooding, be it earth movements and all that. So we haven't included that in the proposal that we have for the model law. And I think because the majority of the infrastructure will be in the urban settings, the majority of the population by 2030 will be in the urban setting, we need to be able to address the effects of climate change in the urban setting. The third thing, you've talked about accountability. And I think it's an important issue, especially in the context of the national level accountability that you have just mentioned. We have in many of our countries constitutions that have entrenched important rights that we are talking about, rights to life, rights to food, rights to health, rights to the environment, which can provide very critical accountability frameworks for our members of parliament when they're holding the executive accountable, but also for the members of the public themselves and public-spirited people when they have to hold government accountable at the national level. So we have to think broadly as we develop the model law to also link it with the human rights framework that we have at the national level, but also at the regional level, the African human rights system, so that we can create a framework of accountability at the national level, because as MP Esther Passaris was saying, we have to take accountability. We can't wait for someone to come and assist us. And if we are not going to wait for someone to come and assist us, then our governments have to be in the forefront. And us as members of parliament have to be able to hold our executives accountable. And where there's failure, then us as members of the civil society, members of the community must also utilize the accountability frameworks that are available to us to hold ourselves accountable, so that we are responsible for our own fate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholas. I want to come to the honorable member right from the front. You can have the mic here, and then we'll still go back. And this side is quiet, and it's the side with the young people. So I'll also provoke them at one point.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. As I had introduced myself, my name is Karongo Wathangwa, the Senator of Kiambu County from the Parliament of Kenya. And Kiambu is not very far from here, just 5 minutes drive from where we are. Now, the honorable member from Ghana has actually captured what I wanted to say, but I want to put it here. Maybe in Africa, maybe you don't need the law. Maybe we need education, you know, because of course the law will be needed because we have to change our curriculum and to change our education systems and all that. But what we need from the beginning is an agreement. We customize from what we have from the Paris Agreement, and then we make it African. Then all African countries can pick custom a treaty from what it was agreed upon, so that we can have an education system that is teaching our children important issues on climate change. We don't have to teach our children about the bodies of an insect. I mean, how Vasco da Gama came to Kenya, the Maji Maji rebellion. Those are informations you can get online anywhere. You know, the reason why they were teaching us that is because the storage of information was just on our heads. There were no technology. So now there's technology to put that information somewhere. So we teach our children things that are going to help them going forward. Also a very important thing is research. You know, if we were to give research like 70% of the effort, or even 80, we are going to probably, we have the solution as Africa. You know, instead of complaining that other countries are emitting more greenhouse gases, and we are not, so we start complaining to them. We can take it as an opportunity. We are the people who are going to heal the world. You know, we are the people who are now providing fresh air to the world, and that is coming up with I don't want to call them you know, when you want to do business with other countries that are emitting that, we have to have our own agreements. Before you do business with us, you have to tell us what you have done yourself as a country from the Western, from the UK or wherever, to reduce that kind of gas emissions. When I was thinking about research, they say cows, together with other livestock, they emit about 40% of the global greenhouse gas emission, 40%. And why? Because they produce methane. Methane is one of the gases that trap the heat when it goes to the atmosphere. But we could do research. Why do they produce methane? It's because of the digestion from what they eat. Maybe there's a plant somewhere in an African forest that a cow can eat and reduce that methane by so many percentages that the whole world will be coming now to Africa to buy that to make the feed. So if we do research, we will be able to know what we are supposed to do to help the other people. And maybe we have the solution as Africa. Research is what is needed. And finally, I'm the chairman of transportation at the Senate. And it was highlighted here by Prof. And I think even when we are talking about the treaty, before we go to the law, because treaties is just agreement, and then agreement, the countries can pick a few things and use them. Transportation, maybe we can come up with a model way of designing our cities. You know, we reduce transportation, we make more walkways, we make them green. And if African countries agree to that, we might not even need a law. You just need to agree and educate people and understand. So I think with that, we have no problem with carpooling because mostly African countries we use public transportation. You know, in America, because everybody has a car, what they have done is to have some lanes on the roads that are called HOV, that is high occupancy vehicle. So you can only use that lane when you are more than one in that vehicle, But in Kenya, in Africa, we have no problem because we use public transportation. So I think we need education. We need to customize the Paris Agreement. And again, we need research. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that submission. Allow me to capture some certain few things. I remember in our statement, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, on the sidelines of the 36th Africa Union Heads of State Summit, which took place in February, we indeed emphasized on research. We are working with data that we do not own, that is manufactured from other quarters, that tell narratives that might not necessarily. Sometimes I fear to quote data. I can actually speak for all day without hearing me talk about a single statistic, because it is not our data. And therefore, Africa is colonized right from the kind of information it's lying to drive its own development paradigm. And probably within the Mondial Law is also to look at whether within the African Union we need to create one overarching research institution and framework to coordinate research across the continent, and how we connect that iteratively across all countries to ensure that we have the evidence that we need. But I think there is a substantive element that you brought that should actually go to straight away to the organizers of African Climate Summit, which relate to standards that should be in place for any investor who intends to put resources in Africa. I think it's important we look at that particular element, which is extremely important. And again, even within the Africa Climate Summit, I think there should be a strong and a resounding resolution among African leaders to pursue speedy justice within the UNFCCC framework. And that came from the honorable member from Ghana. So I felt like it's important to, again, capture that. I want to go right at the back, 2 comments, and then across to my sister in interest of time. I am now harassed. I thought I had the monopoly and luxury, but I'm now harassed. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we agree democratically to use 2 minutes each, will be good. Proceed, my brother.
Hello, thank you so much for the presentations. My name is Alhaji Njai. I'm a professor at University of Wisconsin and also a professor at University of Sierra Leone. I do public health and medicine and climate change. So I do like all the presentations, great presentations and the comments, so I'll be very brief. I just wanted to support the line of our honorable member of parliament from Nairobi who spoke on decolonization. I think, as a scientist, it is critical that we as Africans begin to take on a decolonial approach to everything we are doing. And so when we even thinking about laws, and I like the what the other honorable who spoke just now before me was talking about education. So when we even talk about laws, before we get to policies and all that, we really have to create, have an understanding of what climate change is. And the education is needed, across communities, across populations, for people to understand exactly what is climate change. We do some of these conferences, many of us come, but the community is not here. The community is not engaged. And climate change is a very complex thing that they really need to know. But also the other aspect that is important is the indigenous knowledge systems. We are not capturing, as Africans, for the most part, we've focused on, our Western paradigms. So even when we are thinking about policies, thinking about laws, thinking about models, it's going to be those Western paradigms. our indigenous knowledge systems that have gotten us so far is lost in the process. So how has this knowledge systems enabled us to maintain our forest systems? How have they enabled us to maintain clean water in some communities? How have they enabled us to live via the first principles of conservation? These are all important. And this education from a more decolonial approach also need to happen in schools, because in schools today, and here in Kenya and Uganda and others, you can speak Swahili, but in West Africa, we speak French or English. And oftentimes there is a disconnect between us who are educated and the communities, because language becomes a barrier. So you may know all the climate change in the world, but you have a disconnect with your people because you cannot communicate on the same page. And then, we're talking about climate change again in the middle of daily structural violence that people face, things like poverty, things like other aspects that are become part of our political economies in Africa. And so if you go out there and talk to somebody about climate change, while he needs to just survive, he or she needs to just survive, it becomes a complex thing. So even when we are talking about things like carbon credits coming with all these big models, and if you talk about even, $10 in carbon credit, that becomes an issue for someone whose, daily livelihood rests around $1 per day, something like that. So, and I think there's also the aspect of we are not sufficiently integrating our cultures into our systems. And so oftentimes, the community is left out, the culture is left out. So I've been working, for instance, in Sierra Leone and much of West Africa on Ebola. And I responded to Ebola, and then we came up with a vaccine. But the thing is, when Ebola struck Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia, it wasn't us, the biomedical scientists, who came with the answers. It was actually community knowledge, community epidemiology. They were very innovative. And the culture came in, they begin to develop systems, they begin to kind of come together and develop very, very effective ways of controlling the epidemic. So those are just simple lessons I feel that are lost in us, because oftentimes we go for big policies, big laws, and then we forget the basic indigenous systems and communities into the process. And thereby, when we create the laws, we are not able to implement them effectively in the communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Allow me to pass it right at the back. I can see the hand of Nicholas. Nicholas, on that end, I want to move from this end, going this way. Nicholas, and then I move this way. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Philip. I think when I did listen to the presentation that was made by our colleague from the Pan-African Parliament on behalf of the members of the Pan-African Parliament about the model law, I really wanted to draw this to your attention that it may really help to have a study carried out on the existing pieces of legislation. I learned that at least 4 countries in Africa out of the 55 have got climate change laws in place. How have these climate change laws performed? What are the challenges have they encountered? What are some of the emerging best practices with those laws in pieces of laws in place? I think that way, when you talk of developing a model law, then is a law that is informed by existing practice in more or less similar context, that is African context. I think that's very critical. I'm drawing this to your attention based on the learning we have in Kenya, where we have rolled out what we call subnational level climate change legislation across all the 47 counties. And we had pilot counties, 5 of them, where we did these pieces of legislation.
Then after piloting for like 5 to 6 years, we carried out a study to understand the challenges that we had encountered and some of the emerging practices. And thereafter, it was very easy really to scale it out to the 47 counties, because now we had model county climate change laws, which were informed by a study of the pilot counties that were 5 in number. The other thing which is very critical, really, we should not forget or lose sight of the fact that a policy or a piece of legislation on climate change, particularly at the national level, just one thing, there are accompanying institutions. So the institutional framework is critical. Even for Kenya, which is praised fairly well in terms of being the first country in Africa to put in place a climate change law, it has been a journey really to put in place the corresponding institutions that are responsible for climate change matters. And we are not yet there even as we speak today. Yeah, there are still some challenges. So a lot of emphasis should be put on that passing the laws is one thing, but having the institutions that are truly functional and can execute the mandate expected of them is another thing. Therefore, a strong focus on that as well. I can see I'm being reminded that I should close down. Then lastly, but not least by any means, is that we want to see climate finance flowing to the front line. I think we cannot overstate that or emphasize that. Therefore, yes, good to have overarching climate change laws and policies at the national level, which perhaps the model law will accelerate, but we must move further to have similar policies and laws at the subnational level, which actually creates for channeling of climate finance to the front line. Otherwise, very little climate finance, like for adaptation, will be reaching the poor and the vulnerable who are at the front line. I think I want submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I want to move right at the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Amos Matagaro from Youth Senate here in Kenya. I just want to pick from where Honorable Pasaris left and Honorable Karugo. I just want to say that it's important for us to always appreciate that not all solutions that are proposed, especially from the North, that are really solutions to the challenges facing us. And it's therefore important to acknowledge that education is needed, not just for the primary, secondary, for the university students, but also even for members of parliament. This will enable members of parliament to make laws that are not going to promote solutions that are just going to take us round the challenges that we face, but are not going to provide for us the real solutions, such as carbon. We need to ask ourselves, what's the perception on carbon credit? Is it really a solution that is going to address the challenges that we face as Africa? And if it is a solution, to what extent? By how much is it going to address our challenges? Therefore, I think even before, then passing laws is important, but before we pass these laws, then we must ensure that we are well educated, even as members of parliament, as our leaders, so that they do not pass laws that will promote solutions that come from global north, such as carbon credits, that are not really meant to provide us with the real solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me move across to Madam over there. Then we finish with it.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Agnes Airo from Save the Children. I think with the submissions from the floor, I'll just talk about 3 areas. One, I refer to Prof's presentation from yesterday and the one this afternoon in terms of the law that is going to come up in relation to its domestication. I think one thing that PAP can do once this is done and adapted by the member states is how to have oversight such that across the continent, this law is going to be harmonized in a way that it speaks to each and every country, such that what Prof said yesterday, when they go to negotiate for the climate change issues, they speak as one Africa. So it will be important that once these are harmonized by the different member states, it will it will enable PAP to probably check and monitor how each country is implementing by just comparing how each country is doing against each of those milestones that then PAP will have put up. So that will really help the PAP administration to ensure that this is happening across board and the continent is speaking as one voice, really also is translating to how these laws are being harmonized at the local and national levels. The second one, I think I want to refer to what Honorable Member from Changamwe spoke about, accountability. When we are talking about revenues, domestic revenue as per the different countries, even as we look for donor funding externally, how best then do we check in terms of accountability? This, I think, the model law can then make a very strong framework in terms of a monitoring framework. Why the monitoring framework? Because this is the only chance for the monitoring framework to ensure that countries are accountable to the commitments that they make as per the model law in terms of generating revenue, translating into results to ensure that even with the little that we have in terms of the climate financing, we are seeing results that will be short, medium, and long term to enable us to just see what is it that we are putting in place and how are these translating into long-term results that will ensure that these are going to be translating into the future. The third one is, of course, increased public investment and the fair financing. Even as we develop the model law, and I'm happy that this was passed, that you're going to be developing and formulating this law. But then in terms of public financing and that fair financing element, how then are we going to also take care of the children in the future? Because I think on Monday, the UN just released the General Comment 26 on climate and child rights. So this is something that as we look into that, and as you said, the children are the future. Kindly, in developing this model law, please take note of that General Comment 26 and ensure that these issues that I think also Honorable Jacqueline talked about, where is the nexus in terms of how climate change intersects with health, education, livelihoods, all these other elements, so that under all these issues, we are also having work plans, clear work plans on how countries can achieve this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Agnes, for bringing those particular elements, particularly looking at whether the law ought to or could have some certain expectations around reporting mechanisms for purposes of also at Pan-African level, aggregating key issues of concern for advancing and moving them to the next level. And let me give you the floor.
Merci pour la parole. Je remercie les deux présentateurs pour les présentations combien riches. Je ne vais pas.
Wait a bit, huh? I know people want to hear what you are saying.
Okay. The majority speak English here. Okay, I wait. Je vais m'exprimer en français.
Switch off the microphone that is below. Thank you.
Okay. Je ne vais pas aller sur les points évoqués par les autres. Je remercie les deux présentateurs pour les exposés brillants qui nous ont présentés. Comme vous le savez, le changement climatique, c'est une réalité dans nos pays. Avec le changement climatique, sans aller plus loin, il y a même les droits humains qui sont mis en danger avec les effets des changements climatiques. En tant que président de la commission justice et droits humains au Parlement panafricain, je voulais évoquer ça parce que quand il y a des effets de changement climatique, nous constatons le déplacement de la population, les gens qui sont privés de droits fondamentaux, qui sont privés de logement décent, pour dire que il y a pas mal de points qui pourraient être évoqués dans ce document. Partant de cela, je voudrais dire un peu de mots que cette loi type est une nécessité, est une urgence, comme nous l'avons exprimé au mois de mai à Midland, dans l'hémicycle du Parlement panafricain. Ce qui est très important, c'est qu'après avoir terminé la confection de la loi type et l'envoyer au pays, dans nos pays, ce qui est très important, c'est d'impliquer toutes les parties prenantes, toute la société civile et les parlementaires autour des ministères étatiques en charge des changements climatiques. Donc, les ministères en charge de l'environnement, surtout pour la majeure partie des pays. Donc, nous devons travailler comme un seul homme et voir ce qui est nécessaire pour nos pays. Parce que, comme vous le savez, par exemple, si un pays n'a pas les eaux thermales, par exemple, c'est un exemple que je donne, est-ce que vous allez parler sur les eaux thermales alors que vous n'avez pas les eaux thermales? Donc, nous devons travailler en sorte que ce qui est important, c'est que nous tous, nous devons être impliqués après la domestication, donc quand la domestication de cette loi type est faite, pour que nous puissions avoir un document qui reflète la réalité nationale. Oui, c'est une loi type. C'est un modèle, comme les autres l'ont évoqué. Ce n'est pas à dire qu'à 100% le document est identique. C'est ça que je voulais m'exprimer en cela, que vraiment, cette loi type est une nécessité pour nos pays, pour que vraiment nous puissions travailler dans ce domaine des changements climatiques de façon que ce ne soit pas mélangé avec d'autres réalités, au risque d'oublier beaucoup de choses importantes qui devraient nous aider à faire face aux effets des changements climatiques. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Introduction, please. Sorry, your name.
My name is Nibirandi Jujabari, Burundian, member of Senate Burundi, member of Committee of Finance, Budget, Environment in the Senate of Burundi. In PAP, I am the chair of Committee of Justice and Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I missed that element, but I thought it's also important for the benefit of the other members to get that. I know, sorry, I'm seeing the voice of youth. Unfortunately, it comes to table when the tables are about to fold. Make it super brief.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais aussi, à la suite de l'honorable qui vient de parler, ajouter aussi un point par rapport à la loi type. Yes. Je voudrais ajouter un point par rapport à la loi type, c'est en ce qui concerne les droits humains. Le changement climatique affecte les droits humains, mais la réponse ou les réponses au changement climatique peuvent aussi affecter les droits humains. Je prends les cas de minerais de transition qui sont demandés pour la fabrication des batteries, des autres. Parfois, ils viennent avec, comme il y a une forte demande, Et parfois, dans le pays, les gouvernements arrivent à fermer les yeux sur les violations massives des droits humains, l'utilisation des enfants dans la chaîne de production de ces minéraux, et ça pose un problème qu'on n'arrive pas à résoudre. Et donc, si dans la loi type, on met la dimension où on identifie les effets du changement climatique qui affectent les droits humains, il faudra aussi que cette loi précise que la mise en œuvre des réponses ou des projets en réponse aux questions du changement climatique puisse aussi respecter les droits humains, parce que nous sommes en train de les voir notamment en ce qui concerne la surexploitation du lithium, la surexploitation du cobalt, qui parfois enferme les yeux sur les cas de violations massives des droits des communautés locales et l'utilisation parfois des enfants dans ce cas de ces projets. Merci.
Thank you so much. That was quite a poignant contribution, because the model law must also begin to introspect the implication of response measures in a much more broader way, rather than just on the transition of mineral. It needs to look at that in its broad sense. I want to return it back for quick comments. What I did is just to say the energy of Prof. I know he has been sharing knowledge over many years, so I decided let me harness the knowledge indirectly rather than asking questions. Prof, if you can take 2 minutes just to sum up your impression and any new idea that came that needs to go there. You can do it.
Thank you, Philip. Let me start from, I think, the last but one speaker. And I think he raised a very important issue, the involvement of various stakeholders in the process. I think climate change legislation is one that requires consultation with different parts of societies, particularly those in our rural areas and villages, that they should also have the opportunity, because at the end of the day, they are impacted severely. And I think they should, in the process of drafting the legislation, let's talk to them. Let's bring them together and find out how they feel about this. And I must say also that we have a lot of indigenous ideas in our communities when it comes to addressing climate change. Let us tap on those ones and also make use of it. I must say that our farmers, for instance, have some indigenous knowledge that we may not be aware of when it comes to agriculture, but in other areas also. So let us tap on the indigenous knowledge that we have, and I'm sure it will help. We've touched on education, we've touched on research. Again, I think that is quite important when you make a law, after some time stand back and see how effective the law has been. But we've all heard about the global stocktake, which is captured in the Paris Agreement. And it's all because after 7 years of implementing the Paris Agreement, parties want to stand back and assess the effectiveness of their national determined contributions and the various steps that have been taken. So I think the whole question of stepping back to assess the effectiveness of the legislation should be considered. And the honorable member from Nairobi, I also have a problem. And the problem is this: when the investors, I'm speaking in the context of the carbon credits and so on, when investors come into our countries, they are looking for where they can make profit. And if your rules and laws are so stringent, they will go somewhere else. And so we've been bending to them to accommodate them because we want their investments. How can we be united to the extent that if he doesn't get the incentives or the benefits that he's getting in country A, that if he goes to country B, he will not get the same or something better? So I'm just wondering, because in that case, sometimes we are our own enemies, because he goes to one country and he doesn't like the laws there. So he looks for somewhere he can get it cheaper and benefit more from it. So I don't have an answer, but this is something that we need to look at.
Thank you so much, Prof, for raising that. I think highlighting the need to galvanize our efforts across the continent. Clement, take us home and also give us an indication of how the landscape looks like moving forward. I know you had alluded to it, but now having this conversation and indication. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me again the floor. I must confess that I was basically admiring the wealth of knowledge coming from the participants, and we have really taken note. All of them will find their way in both the contents and probably influence even our process. Particularly the need, for instance, to ensure that we rely heavily on experts, we use data that we can ourselves be able to control, to ensure that what we do is not teleguided by interests from far. And I also wanted to come back to the issue of access to justice. One honorable member and a few more people raised the issue of the justiciability of the Paris Agreement. And I believe that as much as the Paris Agreement may or may not end up being justiciable, at the national level, we have means, in the name of our sovereignty, we have the means of making the principles contained in the Paris Agreement justiciable. I take just the example of the Ugandan climate change law. I think it's section 26, which although again, the right to environment normally as an economic, social, and cultural right would not be justiciable, but this law specifically makes it justiciable. And I think it's a way of also getting out of our colonial standards and typologies. I'm equally aware that Kenya, for instance, the Constitution of Kenya is one of the few constitutions from common law countries which basically goes towards the civil law typology in terms of making rights justiciable, in terms of even the modalities of ratification and domestication of international law. Perhaps also wanted to commend this proposal to carry out a study on how the various laws that are in place are performing. And I think when Professor was highlighting the key elements or the potential key elements of the model law, I was directly making parallels with the Ugandan and the Kenyan climate change law that I managed to read. And I was saying to myself that I could see basically the innovations which these elements could bring to these laws. Indeed, the study should even go beyond Africa. In Latin America, for instance, Chile has also come up with a very interesting climate change law, which we may also draw some inspiration from. And I know that there could be other countries in Africa or even beyond, which can basically assist us to come up with an Africa solution to the climate change issue. Maybe I'll stop there, Honorable Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clement, for really responding and taking some certain actions forward. I think as Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, we will continue to soldier with you on this particular journey, bringing the constituent of non-state actors across Africa to ensure that their voice is actually reflected within the process. I urge you join me in applauding this panel of two gentlemen who have done quite a substantive work in placing the beacons around this model law and where those beacons ought to fall. I think subsequently is now moving the process to the next level. Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you, Clement, for those insightful thoughts. Now, we are not breaking, we are continuing. And my brother Charles has offered. Charles, do you want to break the monotony of me? Or you want me to close the monotony with my monotony? Please, Charles has offered to moderate the other remaining session. Is quite an interesting session. And then we bring the curtains down once that session is done. Thanks. Karibu.
So thank you so much, Philip. Let's clap for Philip for moderating that session. And thank you so much. Clap for yourselves, for this resilience, We are now coming to the climax, and perhaps the climax is more important than the beginning. But for us to be energized enough, Kaidri, may I humbly request you to just stand up a bit. Let's just stand up. All right. Let us do a little bit of arithmetics. We've been talking about climate finance. Finance is about figures. All right. If you don't know your figures well, you are likely to lose on adaptation. All right. So I want you to say 1 and stretch. With all your strength. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. I want to see 4. I can't see 4. Honorable Pasaris, I want to see 4. All right, let's say 4 plus another 4 is equal to 8. 8 plus another 8 is equal to 16. Thank you. You may have your seat. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much. We don't want anybody to sleep because we are getting into perhaps the juiciest part of this particular program. Now, it's my humble pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to invite none other than Senator Bideri, who is, of course, representing the president of Pan-African Parliament, to take us through a very, very important process. We have been engaging in conversations since yesterday, and even including what was happening at CCDA is still part of really this particular process. And I think we have really engaged. We have come up with recommendations. We have come up with proposals. And it's about time now we go through a declaration or a statement that has been put together by the PAP Secretariat, of course, together with PACJA. And this statement is expected to reach the office of the CEO of the Africa Climate Summit, because the voices of parliamentarians must actually be heard. You are the policy makers. You are the people who develop all the resolutions that we need. And therefore, there can never be Africa Climate Summit without the voice of the parliamentarians. And therefore, to take us through that particular process, I want to invite Senator Bideri to help me take the floor and read us through that small statement. Welcome, Senator Bideri. Let's clap for him as he takes the floor. Thank you and welcome, sir.
Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Charles is giving me a task that I did not expect to read the statement. But I think what we shall do is we shall screen it, we shall put it on the screen, and then we will know exactly what to do with it. First of all, let me say that the last session was a bit long, but necessary, because we have received a lot of inputs as Pan-African Parliament as to how we could drive the process of developing a model law, not only the one on climate change, but also on many other model laws, because we have so many in the pipeline and we have had so many in the past. So I think this session, the last session, was very important. And I hope that as we start the process of developing that model law, there will be a lot of engagement of different stakeholders so that it becomes a totally reliable model law for the rest of Africa. So I hope that was a very important session. And I wanted to reiterate that once again. Now, as far as this session is concerned, in May 2003, during the second ordinary session of the 6th Parliament, which was held in Midrand, South Africa, the Pan-African Parliament plenary adopted 3 resolutions which have been circulated. If you look into the 3 documents, take time, and I hope you have taken time to read through them, and I won't go through them. Then we also adopted 1 recommendation on climate change. So all those have been circulated, and this particular session is going to focus a lot on the recommendations which were adopted by the plenary. There were about 9 recommendations for the African Union member states. There were 4 recommendations for the government of the Global North. And then there were 3 for the, I think 2 for the civil society organization. So the statement that we are going to, or we are presenting to you now, is generally drafted from those recommendations. And because it is a draft, we also expect a lot of inputs from you, so that the draft becomes enriched with ideas that you have. And if you'll allow me, I would prefer not to read this draft. Perhaps I will ask you to look at the screen, and then we will be able to request you to make an input on that draft. The draft, as you can see, has about we have about 9 proposals that we would like you to make your comments on. The first 6, as you can see, are general statements which all the statements must have. And I don't think it's necessary for us to go through that. But we'll move on to number 7 and then up to number 14 so that you can be able to make your inputs. Maybe what we'll do is that if you insist, maybe I read through them. I read through them so that perhaps we can move together. This statement reads as follows. We, the African parliamentarians and members of the Pan-African Parliament, the African Union's legislative arm, participating in the African Climate Summit 2023, recording that climate change poses a severe and urgent threat to the development, peace, and security of Africa, and that the continent is disproportionately affected by its impacts, recognizing that Africa has contributed the least to the global greenhouse gas emissions, but has least capacity and resources to cope with the effects of climate change. Acknowledging that adaptation to climate change is a priority and a matter of survival for Africa, and that it can also bring co-benefits for development. Affirming our commitment to advancing the African agenda on climate change and ensuring that the continent's interests are reflected in the global and regional negotiations and actions. Recording the resolution of the Third Pan-African Parliamentary Summit on Climate Policy and Equity of June 2023, which called for expedited action in implementing the commitments made under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement, and for a graceful, just transition and nationally determined contribution, NDCs, implementation that are responsive to African development aspirations and economic realities. The Pan-African Parliament, and indeed the other parliaments, hereby urges the African leaders to prioritize climate change adaptation in their engagement with the global and regional processes and dialogue to address the climate crisis, particularly during the 28th Climate Change Conference, COP28. Calls for increased support and solidarity from the international community, especially the developed countries, to provide adequate and predictable financing, technology transfer, and capacity building for Africa's adaptation efforts, in line with the Paris Agreement goal of mobilizing 100 billion annually by 2020. Stresses the need for more than double adaptation finance for Africa, as current levels are insufficient to meet the estimated adaptation costs in developing countries, especially Africa, which are 5 to 10 times greater than current public adaptation finance flows. 10, supports the finalization and implementation of a global goal on adaptation under the Paris Agreement, which aims to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change in a measurable, reportable, and verifiable manner. Number 11, appeals for enhanced cooperation and coordination among the African countries and regions to share best practices, knowledge, and experiences on climate change adaptation, such as using nature-based solutions, promoting renewable energy, strengthening early warning systems, and building resilient infrastructure. Number 12 warns against pursuing false solutions for climate change in Africa, such as fossil fuel subsidies, geoengineering, or carbon offsetting, which could exacerbate environmental and social problems, undermine human rights, or divert resources from genuine adaptation actions. 13, reaffirms our commitment to work with the African leaders, the African Union Commission, the regional economic communities, the civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders to promote a common African position on climate change adaptation and advocate for a fair, ambitious, and binding global agreement that reflects the principle of equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Finally, commit to execute our legislative mandate and ensure that Africa has the right legal and policy frameworks to aid climate change response interventions in Africa through development of the model climate change law, among other interventions. And this is expected to be submitted on 5th September 2023. Thank you. I decided to read it because I realized that the French speakers would have had no opportunity to follow this. So, that's basically what the draft proposes, and we will need inputs from the plenary. So I think what we shall do is we can take 5 at a time, and I believe the drafters of this statement will be taking note of the comments, because those comments will be able to inform the final draft, which I believe we may not be able to publish or rather reach out before the end of the day. But the information will be used to enrich the statement that will be presented to the summit on that particular date. So we'll take 5 at a time. You'll bear with me. I don't think I know your names, but I'll start with Honorable Barkat. He's the only one that I can remember immediately. And then we'll have a delegate from Egypt, because I've always known him. I don't know from which country. From DRC, Martin. Those are 3. Honorable member from Kenya, Honorable Mar. I hope I've not made a mistake on that. The 5th one? Yes. The 5th one. We need 5. Philip. So let's take those comments from the first 5, and then we'll give an opportunity to others. Please, the drafters, please take note of what is being said so that we can be able to use that information to enrich this statement. So go ahead, Honorable.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le modérateur. Je propose en tout cas qu'il faut insérer. On sait que les pertes et dommages ont été acceptées lors de la COP 27 à Sharm el-Sheikh. Est-ce que tout le monde écoute? Enfin, est-ce que tout le monde a mis son casque pour ceux qui ne parlent pas français? Donc, les pertes et dommages, je propose d'insérer en tout cas les pertes et dommages dans les propositions qui seront soumises au sommet. Ensuite, ça c'est destiné en tout cas aux chefs d'État et des gouvernements. Il faut s'assurer, aujourd'hui, on sait que le pape ne peut pas participer en tant qu'institution aux différentes COP. Donc, il faut qu'au niveau des délégations des pays, on s'assure que les parlementaires, en tout cas, fassent partie de délégations. Un minimum de parlementaires fassent partie de délégations. Ensuite, on propose toujours à ce que, lors de négociations, on dit il faut augmenter le financement de l'adaptation. Les 5 milliards qu'on promet par année n'est jamais complété et ce financement n'est généralement pas disponible facilement. Donc, je pense qu'il faut, dans les négociations, il faudra qu'on trouve, qu'on mobilise les fonds pour transformer les matières premières au niveau de l'Afrique. Pourquoi importer nos matières premières telles qu'elles sont? Il vaut mieux avoir des fonds pour les transformer sur place et comme ça, on va financer nos programmes d'adaptation au niveau national. Merci. Au niveau du continent plutôt. Merci.
Thank you, Honorable Barkat. So we can have the gentleman from Egypt.
First, thank you, Senator Bideri, for giving me the opportunity, and thanks for the statement that you have read is very good, but I have a comment at number 7 and number 9. I will start with number 7, and I will agree with Senator here that we don't have loss and damage. We need our leaders to focus in adaptation, and also they have to make sure about the loss and damage finance, which have been adopted at COP27, to have the mechanism by the end of COP28, to have it work for the countries like Africa and developing countries. This first. Second, when we go to Article 9, we are talking about double adaptation finance. First, we have to make sure they pay for what they agree at Paris Agreement, the 100 billion, and then we ask them to make a double. So we need to highlight that they pay them contribution, and then we can ask them in the same statement to make sure to make it double according to what happened in economic around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so the gentleman from DRC.
Merci beaucoup. Félicitations déjà pour cette déclaration que vous avez proposée dans un temps vraiment très court et bravo pour ça. Alors, il y avait quelques remarques au niveau des formes, mais faute de temps, je vais plus aller au fond. Par rapport à la... Et je voudrais commencer par réitérer qu'il faudra vraiment que ça sorte dans la déclaration clairement que les membres du Parlement panafricain ou les parlementaires des pays africains doivent faire partie des délégations et des différentes réunions qui se déroulent sur les questions du changement climatique. En tout cas, ça doit vraiment figurer. Et je ne sais pas si c'était le problème d'interprétation, mais il m'a semblé qu'il y a une contradiction entre le point 8, le point 7 et le point 8. Lorsqu'on demande les 100 milliards de dollars prévus dans le cadre de l'accord de Paris, mais aussi on affirme que les financements de l'adaptation sont toujours, ne sont pas toujours suffisants. Est-ce que les 100 milliards sont suffisants ou on veut les 100 milliards plus? C'est ça, si peut-être c'est le problème d'interprétation, mais si c'est clair, on peut passer par rapport à ça. Je voudrais aussi par rapport à, en tant que parlementaire, est-ce qu'il y a moyen de faire appel aux autres parlementaires aussi, d'autres pays ou d'autres plateformes, les parlementaires européens, les parlementaires américains, pour que, en tout cas dans le cadre d'une certaine diplomatie parlementaire, qu'on voit comment on peut faire avancer les recommandations des parlementaires sur les questions de changement climatique. Et je vais finir par rapport à la question de marché carbone dont on nous a parlé aujourd'hui. Si quelque part on peut juste avoir même une phrase pour notamment, en tout cas ça me vient comme ça, peut-être appeler à une harmonisation de la législation des États africains sur ce marché. Parce que si on laisse chaque pays avoir sa propre réglementation, il y aura des problèmes où on peut trouver le Ghana qui a une législation favorable et le Togo n'a pas une législation favorable et beaucoup de marchés vont au Ghana et donc ça peut créer le déséquilibre. Donc, juste quelque chose par rapport à ce problème de marché de carbone. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, gentlemen from DRC, for those very good inputs. Let's listen to Honorable Mari, especially about the parliamentary diplomacy, very key, very crucial.
Thank you. Mine is about those countries that have not yet implemented the laws on climate change. Should we have actually a deadline perhaps for them? Because we said nobody should be left behind. So do we need a deadline for maybe for our leaders to take it up? And maybe in terms of climate change, I think it is also high time that we bring this talk at the grassroots level, where students and also members of the community can also be initiated into this discussion so that they can also follow. Otherwise, most of the time we only engage them in planting trees, and that is the only thing that they know. So I would recommend that we also bring this talk, to the community so that everybody participates. We bring everybody to the same level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mar. Those comments are taken care of. Philip, and then we go to the next lot.
I think mine is just to emphasize two important points that came from the previous session so that we don't lose sight of them. I think there is a point that strengthens the element of standards for investors who are investing in Africa, looking at how best we can actually strengthen those standards and ensure that due processes are followed and the rights of citizens are not eroded in the process of investing to respond to climate change. And I think that's quite a poignant point, given the fact that the African Climate Summit will also explore those investment opportunities. I think the second is largely around our a call around Africa to galvanize its efforts in pursuing justice in global space in terms of climate engagement. I think those came from the previous session, and it's important we weave them within this particular statement.
Thank you very much, Philip. Yeah, indeed, in the last session, there were a few inputs regarding perhaps what could be input in this particular statement. So those are noted, but of course, there will be a lot of discussions to make sure that they are clearly inserted and it's not a repetition of what is already there. So let's have the next set of inputs. I saw Honorable Among first, Honorable Passaris, Shakri, the lady on the other side, where are you from? Save the Children, great. Any other? I don't know whether there could be, okay. So, yeah, sorry, yeah. Which organization? Tanzania, okay. So let's start with the Honorable Among. Honorable Jacqueline Among, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Honorable John, and all those who have put this document together. And I think yesterday we raised this in good faith so that actually the voices of the people who make the laws are heard in all these other events. But first, I would like to start with a text. And I would also request that that text, before it is, we may raise our ideas now, but we might have to recirculate it for the wider parliamentarians network to input into it before it is submitted. But one, it's very good to note that the Pan-African Parliament has come up with this text. However, it's important to say African parliamentarians, because you find that I'm from the East African Legislative Assembly. Despite having been a member of the PAP, I may no longer be a member of PAP. But when this statement says on behalf of all parliamentarians of Africa, then it includes all of us, whether in the national assemblies or in the regional assembly. But the preamble can carry Pan-African Parliament. That's one. Two, triple. Instead of doubling funding for adaptation, we need to bring the preamble that even the previous commitments from the global north have not been honored, including $100 billion US. But even then, we need not just only to double, but to triple the funding for adaptation. Because as it is now, Uganda, Africa contributes less than 4%, but the rest of the world looks now at Africa. So doubling is not an issue. Committing to implementing what was earlier on committed to and honoring it is another issue. This should be highly put in the text so that when Africa goes to the United Nations Conference of Parties, this could be an issue that could be raised there by our AGN Africa group of negotiators. Then the other issue that I wanted to raise is when you look at the globe, whenever we go to the COPs, we go pushing for our issues. Yes, last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, loss and damage was really a fight, but our issue never even reached at the agenda, taking Africa as a special circumstances region. This should still be emphasized because indeed it is special, despite all the massive resources that we have and all that, we still face the biggest emission from the global emitters. So even in our parliamentary text, this should not be left behind. It should be put in our communique to the team, because this is building towards COP28 in Dubai. Then something that we are always fighting for is whenever there are debates on any issues, parliaments come at the national level or at the implementation level, and we sometimes parliaments not understand most of these multilateral instruments that the executive puts on behalf of the member countries. So we are calling upon the Africa Climate Summit on an annual basis to have parliamentarians go side by side with all the other stakeholders, so that annually we have an annual parliamentarians engagement to feed into the Africa Group, Africa Summit, and eventually to the COP. That should never be left behind. Then I think we also need to globally, because this text will lead to COP28, we will go as a bigger group of the African parliamentarians to mobilize the other parliamentarians in the other parts of the world to have parliamentarians participate effectively, not on the side events, direct participation and formal participation of parliamentarians at the conferences of parties, so that when parliamentarians return home, they are able to domesticate most of these instruments. So, in a nutshell, I want to re-echo also the point that was made by Philip. Investment is an issue now. Targeted investment for Africa, not in investment dictated by the global north. They bring money, let's go into this, because that money is going to go back to help the global north, not the south. Let us put money and attract investment to areas that can directly impact on the African people who are facing the highest percentage of climate change. That is in agriculture, and that's why we call upon targeted investment. So I thought I would make those. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Jacqueline, particularly on the preamble. That was an observation we had made. So it's well taken care of. Then the issue of engagement of parliamentarians, the parliamentary diplomacy, which is one of our weak link as parliamentarians. I think you've overemphasized on that one. We need to take note of that as well. Plus the other issues which we have raised, I believe the technocrats will make sure that they are completely harmonized with what is possible and what is not possible. So thank you. Let's listen to Chakri from Morocco.
D'accord. Alors, merci, Président. Merci aux parlementaires panafricains de cette déclaration très intéressante. Nous sommes très contents de cette déclaration. Saïd Chakri, je suis le point focal de PACJA au niveau du Maroc. Alors, permettez-moi de soulever 2 points. Alors, le premier point, c'est que toujours on dit que l'Afrique est le continent le moins polluant. C'est une réalité. Mais lorsque on entre dans les processus, on met l'Afrique avec tous les autres continents avec le même processus.
Sorry, Chakri, one second. One second. I want to follow the procedure. I think Honorable Pasaris was number 2. I skipped her. Let her go first and then you come back. In Parliament, politicians will follow protocol. Otherwise, should not give me a vote.
Thank you. Thank you.
I apologize for that.
No, it's okay. I was thinking that maybe there is a need for us to look at a global approach, because we've been talking about the Africa Free Trade Continental Free Trade Area. We've been also talking about the labor movements and coming up with African solutions. This climate, the Africa Climate Summit, is about the continent speaking with one voice. And I think that will deal with the challenges that the professor saw on how when one part of the country or the continent becomes attractive, then we undermine each other. So if we talk globally, then we look at all the solutions. I think there's going to come a time that we're going to do clusters in Africa where we look at the strengths of each of the players in each of the countries in the continent and let them be empowered to deliver that to the continent. Because after all, we're 1 billion plus people. That's a huge market in itself. So I feel we shouldn't just look at climate. We should look at from the Africa Union to the Pan-African Parliament to YALA to the parliaments that we have, United Parliaments that we have in the rest of Africa. How do we have this global approach and put it there as a need to make sure that we speak with one voice, we strengthen each other rather than weaken each other. And that should be the driving force, because that is what will also help this particular legislation work. And then the importance of ensuring that no one is left behind. Well, whether it's the communities at the grassroots, the executive, the elected leaders, all the institutions that we have, because I think Pan-African Parliament is weakened by the constant conflict with the African Union. I think it's about time that we resolve all these issues so that when we approach any problem, we're able to approach it as one force, because divided we fall, united we stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Passaris. I think that's more or less putting emphasis on what I think Philippa talked about, the standardization, which I believe should be captured, I think, in the model law. But at the end of the day, we know it's political will, which I think Professor Sapp was talking about. Some countries move faster than the others, but I think if we have a standard, that would be extremely important. So I think the point by Honorable Passaris is well noted. Thank you. Shakri, sorry for cutting you short, but
it's normal.
That was the arrangement from the beginning.
C'est vrai, j'ai compris. Alors, merci encore, je répète, merci pour le parlementaire panafricain de cette très importante déclaration. Moi, j'ai deux points rapidement. On dit toujours que l'Afrique, c'est le moins polluant, mais c'est le plus touché. Mais lorsqu'on met les processus, surtout le processus de finance-climat, il le met avec un processus général. Je m'explique. Par exemple, lorsqu'on met le protocole de Kyoto et lorsqu'on a mis surtout les MDP, c'est-à-dire les mécanismes de développement durable propres, l'Afrique, c'est le continent le moins qui a bénéficié des fonds. Lorsqu'on regarde maintenant les fonds verts climat, l'Afrique, il a bénéficié le moins des fonds. Et lorsqu'on marque maintenant sur tout ce qui est marché de carbone, je suis sûr que l'Afrique, ce sera le moins qui a bénéficié. Dans ce cadre-là, je propose que le Parlement panafricain met quelque chose pour privilégier l'Afrique, surtout lorsqu'il s'agit des financements. Et on ne doit pas les mettre, si vous voulez, un cas général. Donc, il doit être facilité, le financement doit être facilité pour que le continent africain en bénéficie. C'est très important comme point. Deuxième point, c'est que parfois, lorsqu'il y a, par exemple, des stratégies au niveau de l'Afrique, je parle, par exemple, des contributions nationales déterminées, je parle des positions, parfois, par exemple, position de l'Afrique, il faut qu'ils soient faites par les Africains eux-mêmes. Il ne faut pas qu'ils soient faites par d'autres, surtout d'autres pays étrangers. Je donne l'exemple. Je vois que dans même le sommet africain prochain, McKinsey, il va parler de surtout finance-climat. Alors que on connaît McKinsey, c'est quelque chose américain. Donc, on doit laisser la position africaine faite par les Africains eux-mêmes. On doit laisser les stratégies africaines faites par les Africains eux-mêmes. Et on doit ici avoir une certaine autonomie et une interdépendance pour qu'on ne soit pas influencé. Parce que déjà le protocole, l'accord de Paris, il était déjà mis par les pays du Nord. Et on connaît maintenant les difficultés. Regardez par exemple l'article 6 et on est en train de expliquer l'article 6 alors que eux ils ont déjà compris l'article 6 depuis 2015 et nous sommes en 2023, on continue encore à décortiquer l'article 6. Voilà, merci.
Thank you, Shakri. So that's the independence that we still need. Yeah, so well noted. The next intervention is from the lady from the Save the Children.
Yes, thank you. I think in line with the implementation and monitoring, probably I think PAP could include something about how PAP reinforces to enhance commitment by member states to just ensure that they respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and children's rights by virtue of the fact that they have signed to the Paris Agreement, just to ensure that the member states are not violating these rights by just reducing environmental harm to both the young and the old. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think well noted. Well noted. So let's get an intervention from the lady from Tanzania, I think. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Wena Hilary from the civil society in Tanzania. I wish to understand how the Pan-Africa Parliament or the African parliamentarians work with the African group of negotiators. Thank you.
think that's a question. Okay. I think we'll answer it maybe later on. I wish we would come to that one later if there are other interventions as far as the statement is concerned. Are there any other contributions? Looks like there are no other contributions. I do note the fact that this statement has come in at a short notice, and therefore it was very difficult to really make comment on each article by article. But I also believe that your inputs were very useful, and the technocrats have noted that. And all the inputs will be used to enrich the statement. Hopefully, it will be done as fast as possible so that we can be able to, if possible, be able to share it with all of you before it is presented to the summit. So I think they take note of that. Now, in terms of the last question, how the Pan-African Parliament works with the Africa Group of Negotiators. The Pan-African Parliament actually, if you have realized, and that's why we are in this particular meeting, we are in partnership with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, which is a key actor in terms of providing inputs to the Africa Group of Negotiators. So we have that avenue to be able to influence what goes on what goes on in terms of negotiations that the African Group of Negotiators have undertaken on behalf of the African continent. So much of the input comes from the civil society plus other stakeholders. We as parliamentarians, obviously, we are part of the state, and our state parties are also involved. So what we do is that if there are any specific inputs, parliaments, national parliaments in particular, want to be evidently input in the negotiations, that also goes through the state parties. So I would say really that's how we do it. And the members of the Pan-African Parliament are actually members of the national parliaments. For instance, we saw a number of parliamentarians from the Republic of Kenya. I'm a member of parliament from Rwanda, and there are several others from, there's a member of parliament from Djibouti, Burundi, and so on. So we use those avenues to more or less influence what the Africa Group negotiators are able to pursue in those negotiations. And remember, the Pan-African Parliament is also an organ of the African Union. So really what the African Union, what the Africa Group of Negotiators do is that they take the position of the African Union. So in a way, we have that influence both at the national level, but also at the African Union level. Basically, I think that should be my response to that question. I hope you are happy and satisfied with that answer. Thank you. I can see you nodding. I think you agree with me. Thank you so much. So I can see my technical advisor is looking at me. Perhaps there's something I've omitted. Looking at the fact that there are no other inputs from you, we are as inclusive as possible. I hope there's nobody who has been denied an opportunity to make an input. And the inputs were very useful, and we'll try to factor them in the final statement. The technocrats have taken note of that. There are some that were of political nature, and I think we have given guidance on that, particularly the statement from Jacqueline. That was well noted, Honorable Jacqueline. And then other statements that have been given by all of you. So without wasting a lot of time, I know we have had a long day, and I want to sincerely thank you for the contributions since yesterday and today. And on behalf of the Pan-African Parliament, I want to sincerely thank you for the effort you have put in this partnership with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And I believe on 5th of this month, we shall be able to submit a statement that hopefully will be able to influence the decisions of our heads of state, as well as the African Union. So with those few remarks, let me say thank you and wish you a very good evening.
Just one quick comment. Discussions on the other sessions across in CCDA are still going on. I know you might catch up 1 or 2 ideas that can save the world. So let's join the discussions which are also on the other side. Thanks.